The heat on August 14, 1952, was not merely a weather condition. It was a physical weight pressing down on the asphalt of 125th Street, a suffocating blanket of humidity that made the air shimmer above the pavement. It was the kind of heat that made tempers short and decisions rash, the kind of atmosphere where the line between life and death in Harlem became as thin as the smoke rising from a discarded cigarette. At exactly 2:14 p.m., Charlie Morrison, a man whose soul was as scarred as the burning cross he worshipped, steered his battered Ford sedan onto Lenox Avenue. Morrison was a desperate fugitive, a low-ranking enforcement arm of the Ku Klux Klan from down south, who had made the fatal error of believing that his white skin was a universal passport to immunity, even here, in the beating heart of Black America. He was running from a botched lynching in Georgia that had drawn too much federal heat, and in his twisted logic, he believed disappearing into the chaotic density of New York City was his salvation. He saw Harlem not as a sovereign nation with its own king, but as a lawless jungle where he, a predator by nature, could scavenge until the heat died down. He could not have been more wrong. From the moment his tires crossed the invisible border at 110th Street, he had entered a chessboard where the pieces were already moving against him, controlled by a hand he could not see and a mind he could not comprehend. Morrison was looking for leverage, a quick score to fund his escape to Canada. What he found was a sleek black Cadillac Series 62, parked idling outside a high-end boutique near the corner of 135th. Inside sat a woman of striking elegance, her posture regal, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. This was Mamie Johnson. To the uninitiated, she was a wealthy target. To Harlem, she was the queen, the wife of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Morrison, blinded by prejudice and desperation, saw only a colored woman with diamonds. He approached the car, the sweat stinging his eyes, and leveled a snub-nosed .38 revolver at the window. He climbed into the passenger seat, his breath smelling of stale whiskey and fear, and barked an order that would seal his fate more effectively than any judge's gavel. He told her to drive. He told her she was his ticket out. Mamie Johnson did not scream. She did not tremble. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the intruder with a mixture of pity and icy detachment that unnerved him instantly. She knew something he did not. She knew that the moment he touched the handle of her car door, the clock had started ticking on his life. She shifted the car into gear, not out of submission, but to move the game to the location her husband would prefer. As the Cadillac pulled away, a young shoeshine boy named Jeremiah, who had been buffing the wingtips of a deacon on the corner, paused. He had seen the gun. He had seen the face of the man. He didn't run to a police call box. He didn't scream for a beat cop. He packed his box calmly, walked into the back of the Apollo Theater's loading dock, and whispered 5 words to the massive bouncer guarding the door. Someone took the queen. Information in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem traveled faster than electricity. It moved through a neural network of street vendors, rooftop lookouts, bartenders, and number runners. By 2:32 p.m., 18 minutes after the abduction, Bumpy Johnson was sitting in his private booth at the Garden of Joy, staring at a chessboard. He was midway through a game with a visiting professor from Howard University. A lieutenant, a man named Junie, with a scar running through his eyebrow, walked over and whispered into Bumpy's ear. The silence that followed was absolute. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, the jazz band rehearsing in the corner, it all seemed to evaporate. Bumpy did not flip the table. He did not roar in anger. He simply picked up his black queen, held it for a second, and placed it gently back on the board. He stood up, buttoned his tailored Italian suit jacket, and adjusted his cufflinks. "Close it," he said softly. Close it all. What followed was a demonstration of power that no mayor, no police commissioner, and no governor could ever hope to replicate. Bumpy Johnson didn't just command a gang, he commanded an ecosystem. The order went out. The gate is down. Within 10 minutes, every delivery truck servicing Harlem stalled in the middle of the major intersections, creating gridlock that blocked all exits. Taxis refused fares. The subway toll booths were suddenly unmanned, with turnstiles jammed. Harlem became a fortress. Morrison, sitting in the passenger seat of the Cadillac, began to notice the change in the atmosphere. The streets were becoming strangely empty of traffic, yet the sidewalks were filling with people. Silent people. They weren't looking at the shop windows. They were looking at the car. Hundreds of eyes, dark and unblinking, tracking the vehicle as it moved slowly through the congestion. Morrison began to panic. "Why aren't we moving?" he screamed, waving the gun. Mamie kept her eyes on the road, her expression unreadable. "Traffic," she said simply. "It's Harlem. Things happen." But Morrison sensed the lie. He felt the hostility radiating from the brickwork itself. He tried to force her to turn down a side street, but a garbage truck had, accidentally, backed into a fire hydrant, blocking the way. He demanded she turn left, but a wall of men, arms crossed, standing shoulder to shoulder, blocked the alley entrance. They didn't have weapons drawn. They were the weapon. The city was hurting him. He was a rat in a maze, and the walls were closing in. The heat in the car was becoming unbearable, but he didn't dare roll down the window. He was trapped in a glass cage, on display for a jury that had already reached a verdict. By 3:15 p.m., the Cadillac was funneled toward a dead-end street near the Harlem River, an industrial stretch of warehouses that had been cleared of all civilian presence. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of tugboats. Morrison realized too late that he wasn't escaping. He was being delivered. He forced Mamie to stop the car. His hands were shaking so violently that the gun rattled against the dashboard. "Get out!" he screamed, using her as a human shield as he dragged her onto the cobblestones. He looked around for the police, for a squad car, for anything familiar. There was nothing. Just the towering brick walls and the long shadows of the afternoon sun. Then, from the shadows of the warehouse entrance, a figure emerged. It wasn't a platoon of soldiers. It wasn't a SWAT team. It was one man. Bumpy Johnson walked slowly into the sunlight, his hands empty, hanging loosely by his sides. He walked with a rhythmic, predatory grace, the stride of a man who owns the ground beneath his feet. He stopped 20 feet away. He didn't look at the gun. He looked directly into Morrison's eyes. The psychological weight of that stare was heavier than physical violence. It was a look that stripped Morrison of his ideology, his arrogance, and his identity, leaving him as nothing more than a frightened man holding a piece of metal. "You're lost," Bumpy said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the humid air with the clarity of a church bell. "You came into my house. You took my wife, and you think that gun makes you a man." Morrison tightened his grip on Mamie, sweat pouring down his face. "Stay back! I'll kill her! I swear I'll kill her!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. He was a member of the Klan, a man who claimed superiority by birthright, yet here he was, cowering before a black man who radiated the kind of regality Morrison had only ever read about in fairy tales. Bumpy took a step forward. Just one. "If you pull that trigger," Bumpy said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low rumble, "death will be a luxury you cannot afford. You think the police are coming? The police are stuck in traffic on 125th Street. You think your friends are coming? You have no friends here. Look around you." Morrison darted his eyes to the rooftops. On every ledge, in every window of the warehouse, silhouettes appeared. Men with rifles, men with bats, men with nothing but their bare hands. They were silent. They were waiting. The realization hit Morrison like a physical blow. He was already dead. The only variable was how much pain he would endure before the end. "Let her go," Bumpy said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, as if the action had already occurred in the future, and Morrison just needed to catch up. "Let her go, and you walk to the police precinct. You live to sit in a cage. Keep holding her, and I will peel the skin from your bones, slowly, right here on this street, and I will make sure you remain conscious for every second of it." The bluff, if it was a bluff, was magnificent, but it wasn't. Morrison saw the truth in Bumpy's eyes. This was a man who had read Nietzsche and Machiavelli, a man who understood that true power is not the application of force, but the promise of it. Morrison's will broke. The superiority complex of the Klansman crumbled into the survival instinct of the coward. His arm dropped. Mamie, with a dignity that was breathtaking, stepped away from him. She walked toward her husband, smoothing the wrinkles in her dress. Bumpy didn't embrace her immediately. He nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of her strength. She walked past him to the waiting car of a lieutenant. Only then did Bumpy turn his full attention back to Morrison. The Klansman dropped the gun. It clattered on the cobblestones, a useless toy. He fell to his knees, sobbing, raising his hands in surrender. "I surrender! Call the cops! Please, just call the cops!" he begged. The irony of a KKK enforcer begging for the protection of the law against a black crime lord lost on no one but him. Bumpy walked up to him. He didn't kick him. He didn't punch him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a switchblade. The sound of the blade snapping open was the loudest thing in the world. Morrison squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the throat slit. But Bumpy simply reached down, grabbed Morrison by the collar of his dirty shirt, and brought the blade to the man's cheek. With the precision of a surgeon, he carved a single, shallow line down the side of Morrison's face. It wasn't a lethal wound. It was a brand. "This isn't for me," Bumpy whispered, leaning close enough that Morrison could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath. "This is so that everywhere you go, every time you look in a mirror, every time a white man or a black man sees you, they will ask about that scar. And you will have to remember that you got it because you forgot your place. You walked into Harlem, and the king let you live." Bumpy stood up, wiped the blade on Morrison's shirt, and folded it away. "Get him out of my sight," Bumpy commanded to the shadows. Two large men emerged, grabbed the sobbing Morrison by the arms, and dragged him not to the river, but toward the police station on the perimeter. They didn't hurt him. They didn't need to. He was broken. That evening, the traffic jams cleared as mysteriously as they had appeared. The shops reopened. The music started up again in the jazz clubs. At the Smalls Paradise, Bumpy Johnson sat at his usual table, a fresh cigar in his hand. Mamie sat beside him, sipping a glass of champagne. No one spoke about the incident loudly, but everyone knew. The story passed from table to table, from barstool to barstool, growing with every retelling. By midnight, it wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a mythology. They said Bumpy stopped the sun in the sky. They said his eyes turned red. But the truth was far more potent. The legend of the untouchable law was born that night. It wasn't written in any penal code, but it was etched into the consciousness of the city. The KKK, the Mafia, the police. They all learned a lesson that day. You could run rackets, you could play the numbers, you could hustle. But you did not touch the family of Bumpy Johnson. you did not disrespect the sanctity of the community he claimed as his own. This story illustrates why Bumpy remains such a polarizing and magnetic figure in American folklore. We love the outlaw who operates by a code strictly more moral than the law itself. Morrison represented the chaos of hatred. Bumpy represented the order of violence. In a world where the law often failed to protect the citizens of Harlem, Bumpy stepped in as the necessary evil, the monster who kept other monsters at bay. He was a criminal, yes. A murderer, certainly. But on that hot August day in 1952, to the people of Harlem, he was the only government that mattered. He was the grandmaster who saw the checkmate before the pawn had even moved. And there is a footnote to this legend, a detail often left out of the police reports but whispered by the old-timers on 125th Street. Years later, it was said that Charlie Morrison, serving time in a federal penitentiary, would often wake up screaming in the night. He wasn't afraid of the other inmates. He wasn't afraid of the guards. He was screaming because in his dreams, the world would go silent, the traffic would stop, and he would feel the weight of a city watching him, judging him, waiting for the king to arrive. The second tale takes us forward to the winter of 1963, a time when the heroin epidemic was beginning to claw its way through the veins of New York City, threatening to rot the Big Apple from the inside out. This story isn't about a violent confrontation with an outsider, but a battle for the soul of the neighborhood itself. It centers on the Christmas of the blue envelopes. It was December 23rd, 1963. A bitter wind was whipping off the Hudson, cutting through the thickest wool coats. Harlem was shivering, but the cold wasn't the only thing biting. A new syndicate from downtown, led by a ruthless ambition to flood the uptown market with low-grade, lethal dope, had set up shop near Sugar Hill. They didn't care about the ecosystem. They only cared about the profit margins. They were selling to kids, selling near schools, breaking the unwritten rules that Bumpy had enforced for decades. Bumpy profited from vice, undeniably, but he managed it like a public utility. There were lines you didn't cross. The leader of this new faction was a man named Crazy Joe Gallo, not the famous mobster, but a wannabe usurper using the name to strike fear. He had made a public statement in a pool hall on 145th Street. Bumpy is an old man. His time has passed. The future is white powder, and it belongs to whoever has the guts to sell it. Bumpy heard this. He was sitting in the back of the Lenox Lounge, watching the snow fall outside. He was older now, his hair graying, his movements slightly slower, but his mind was sharper than ever. He didn't send hitmen. He didn't start a war that would bring the heat of the NYPD down on everyone before Christmas. Instead, he turned to his right-hand man and said, "It's the season of giving. Let's give them something they can't refuse." On Christmas Eve, every family in the tenement buildings surrounding the usurper's stash houses received a blue envelope slipped under their door. Inside was not money, but a letter. It was typed, polite, and unsigned. It read, "Tonight, the rats will be driven from the cellar. Keep your windows closed. Keep your children inside. Santa Claus is cleaning house." At 11:47 p.m., the power to 3 specific city blocks was cut. Total darkness. The snow reflected the moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows. Then came the sound, not gunfire, but music. From a rooftop, a loudspeaker began to play "Silent Night," sung by Mahalia Jackson. It was loud, echoing off the canyon walls of the tenements. As the hymn played, 50 men dressed in black coats moved into the territory. They carried baseball bats wrapped in velvet, a signature Bumpy touch. It was brutal, but it was quiet. They entered the stash houses. They didn't kill the dealers. They gathered them up, stripped them of their coats and shoes, and marched them out into the snow. They took the heroin, kilos of it, and dumped it into the sewer grates, washing it away with buckets of hot water brought from the nearby bakery. The product, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, dissolved into the filth of the city. The dealers, shivering, terrified, and humiliated, were lined up against a wall. Bumpy emerged from a car, wrapped in a camel hair coat. He looked at the shivering men, then at the piles of slush where their fortune had disappeared. He handed the leader, the man who had called him old, a train ticket. "One way," Bumpy said. "To Florida. You like the heat? Go find it. Harlem is cold for people who don't know how to dress." He then turned to the tenements, where hundreds of faces were pressed against the glass, watching the silent theater. He tipped his hat. The lights flickered back on. The music stopped. The invaders vanished as quickly as they had arrived, leaving the usurpers freezing in the snow, broken not by bullets, but by the sheer organizational genius of the man who ran the city. The next morning, on Christmas Day, a truck parked on that same corner. It was filled with turkeys and toys. The driver simply said, "Compliments of the North Pole." Everyone knew who the real Santa was. It wasn't the fat man in the red suit. It was the man in the camel hair coat who understood that to rule a people, you must feed them, protect them, and when necessary, bring the wrath of God down upon their enemies with the style of a Hollywood director. These stories, whether completely factual or embellished by the passage of time and the romance of the streets, paint a picture of Bumpy Johnson that transcends the typical gangster narrative. He wasn't just a thug. He was a phenomenon. He was a man who understood that power is a performance. He played the role of the villain so well that he became a hero. He navigated the treacherous waters of race, crime, and politics in 20th century America with a compass that pointed to his own true north. We look at Bumpy Johnson and we see the complexity of the American dream twisted in a funhouse mirror. He wanted what everyone wanted: respect, sovereignty, and security for his family. Denied the legal avenues to achieve this, he built his own avenues out of concrete and blood. He was the professor of the underworld, a man who could discuss philosophy with a scholar in the morning and order a hit in the afternoon, all without changing his expression. So, when you walk the streets of Harlem today, past the gentrified coffee shops and the historic brownstones, listen closely. You might just hear the echo of a chess piece clicking against a board. You might feel the ghost of a black Cadillac gliding by. It's the spirit of Bumpy Johnson, the king who didn't need a crown, reminding us that in the game of life, it's not about the pieces you hold, but how you move them. What do you think? Was Bumpy a monster or a necessary guardian in a prejudiced world? Does the end justify the means when the law itself is unjust? Let me know in the comments below. Let's keep the legend alive.